Hello, history students. Today we're going to talk about the Cold War.
And the Cold War took about 50 years, but we're going to talk about it in about 10 minutes.
So the Cold War happens after World War II. Europe was in ruins after World War II, which means basically it's pretty blown up and destroyed. The Soviet Union occupied most of Eastern Europe and Central Europe. They also occupied East Germany after the war. The Soviet Union cut this part of Europe off from Western Europe. Basically, they said that people from Western Europe weren't welcome in Eastern Europe. This was called the Iron Curtain, and it was a division between the Eastern countries and the Western countries. While this wasn't an actual wall, it was a pretty clear division where people from the East weren't welcome in the West and people from the West were not welcome in the East.
So here's a map to kind of give you an idea of that. On the right, we have the East, and on the left, we have the West, and this imaginary Iron Curtain separated the two.
So, the United States decided it was in their interest to rebuild Europe and prevent political and economic instability. George C. Marshall's plan, the Marshall Plan, rebuilt Western Europe through financial aid. The Marshall Plan was also intended to stop the spread of communism.
Many people were very poor after the war, so communism, which tries to give a lot to the poor, was very appealing. But it also tells everybody what to do, and so the U.S. didn't like that idea. So here's an example of the food or any supplies being shipped to the, people in Europe would have this sticker on it. So you knew it was coming from the United States, so hopefully you would be very friendly to the United States and not to the Soviet Union.
So, here's an example of where the green countries are helped by the Marshall Plan. The blue bars on the green countries show how much money they got from the Marshall Plan or from the United States government. So what you'll notice is most of the countries that have money were in Western Europe or were outside of that curtain we talked about, that Iron Curtain that the Soviet Union controlled.
So West Germany at the end of World War II was occupied, meaning Americans and British and French troops were in West Germany. They were running the country. West Germany resumed, meaning it started up again, self-government and became a democratic country. So once West Germany could rule itself again, it became a democracy. East Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union. East Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union until 1989. So West Germany, the side that had the U.S., French, and British troops, eventually becomes its own country and runs itself again. East Germany, controlled by the Soviet Union, remains under the control until the end of the Cold War. So here's an example on the map. You can see here, I'll circle it in green, West Germany, controlled by the three different countries. And East Germany, I'll circle in blue, controlled by the Soviet Union. And this little speck here in the middle was the capital, Berlin. It was also divided, just like Germany was.
So, towards the end of World War II, after the Japanese were defeated, Japan was occupied by the United States. Japan resumed self-government, and Japan became a democracy and a strong ally of the United States. So unlike Germany, Japan was only occupied by the United States because the United States did most of the fighting by themselves.
So here's a map. You can see I'll circle in red the world map here. And I'll circle again in red. We've got Japan. And to the right is the islands of Japan. And the U.S. had full control over all these islands for about 7 years.
So, after World War II ends, the United Nations was formed. The UN was created to prevent future wars but they had a lot more power than the League of Nations ever had. The UN has the power to use the military force, and they're just a lot more strong. They're still around today.
And unlike the United Nations, the League of Nations, the U.S. did join the United Nations. And here's a picture of the United Nations building in New York City.
If you've been to New York City, there's a good chance you've seen this building.
And it has all the flags of the participating countries in front of it. And here is, I'll circle it in red, the flag of the United Nations. So anytime countries go to help another country under the control of the United Nations, instead of their own flag, they'll usually have this flag on their uniforms or on their vehicles.
So, the Cold War was a period of tension, okay, between the United States and the Soviet Union. There wasn't actual fighting between the two countries, but they weren't friendly towards each other at all. The rest of the world was divided in support between the two superpowers. So basically, the rest of the world had to pick, are we going to be on the United States side or the Soviet Union side?
So again, here's a map of the world, and the countries you see in blue, and again I'll circle most of them again, in blue were mostly friendly to the United States and supported them. The countries that you see in red, and I'll circle them, were friendly with the Soviet Union. And the countries that you see in yellow, at one point were very friendly with the Soviet Union and believed in communism just like they did, but later on they become less friends over time. But they don't end up supporting the United States either.
So, there's some key differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States had a capitalist economy, and their government was a democracy. The Soviet Union had a communist economy. It was ruled by the unelected Communist Party. The Soviet government was a dictatorship. So, the American economy and government system was directly opposite of the Soviet Union economy and government system. So that's a big part of why they couldn't ever agree with each other.
All right, so here, pictures of what you would see in a capitalist country. You can see everything on the left of very poor conditions, people in poverty, not having nice things, to things on the right. People who are very rich and very nice places to live. That is capitalism, and it's separated by money. That decides how much nice things you have.
Communism is this idea where you're not going to have poor people, but you're also not going to have rich people. So the idea is that everyone works, but everyone also shares their wealth together as a group. So everyone's equal. It's a very nice idea in concept, but in actuality, it typically does not work out. Typically, there is still an upper class and a lower class.
But the economy is not driven by money. It's not decided by how much money you have. It's decided on a government who decides what you get. So America tried to stop the spread of communism. It was seen as undemocratic, you can't vote for anything, and also anti-American, because in America we believe you have the right to choose things, and it took away some choice from you. So we had two ideas. At first, we wanted to simply contain communism. It was called containment. So we couldn't change the fact that there were communist countries, there they are, but what we could do is stop any new ones from becoming communist. And imagine keeping it in a container, like you put a person in a container, after a while they can't breathe anymore, they're going to die. And so that's what we thought about communism. Keep it in a container, eventually it's going to die off. After more countries in Asia, and later South America, Latin America, started becoming communist, we came up with a new idea called the domino theory. So just like when you see a line of dominoes that you line up, you knock one over, and the next one goes over and gets knocked over. We thought this might happen in Asia and South America. If we let one country become communist, the one next to it will become communist, then the one next to it will become communist, and so on and so on and so on, and then who knows, maybe we have communists attacking us from Mexico. There you go, is the idea of containment. So again, just imagine a person or a living thing inside the container. After a while, they run out of air and they're gone. So communism, the same thing. We just contain it and it'll just die off. And so that was for Europe. We just thought, let's put all this part in a big container and then it will just eventually go away.
So the domino theory is this idea where if one country becomes communist, the country next to it might also become communist, which will then make the next country next to it become communist also. So Vietnam is a major country that had a revolution and became communist. The United States sent troops there to help support the non-communist forces.
We were afraid if Vietnam became communist, then the following countries, the next countries, in all this area would become communist too. And the same thing happened later in the 1980s in Central America. Nicaragua became communist. We went in to stop that because we were afraid if they succeeded, they would move into Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and on into Mexico, and next thing you know, into Texas, maybe.
So there's a lot of military alliances during this time period. In 1949, the United States and Western European nations make an alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. You guys might hear about them because they still exist today. Okay. In 1955, the Soviet Union saw that the U.S. made this group called NATO and said, hey, that's pretty cool. We're going to make a treaty organization also. We're going to call ours the Warsaw Pact. So the U.S. had NATO, and the Soviet Union had the Warsaw Pact.
So again, we see this map again, and all the countries in red were in the Warsaw Pact. And the countries see in blue were in NATO.
So there were some wars during this time period, though the United States and the Soviet Union never fought each other. From 1950 to 1953, the Korean War happened. It ended in a stalemate or a tie where the country was split into North Korea and South Korea. In the North, they're communist, which they still are today. And in the South, they're capitalist. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was built to stop East Germans from leaving the Soviet Union.
So here's a picture of the wall, and on the right is the west side. You can see people were allowed to spray paint it and graffiti it and have fun with it. And on the east side, the communist side, you can see your troops guarding it, barbed wire, all sorts of things to keep people from escaping.
So in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. The Soviet Union tried to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. The U.S. didn't like this, and the crisis ended when the Soviets changed their minds. Basically, the two countries got within hours of actually fighting each other in an all-out war. Fortunately, the Soviet Union backed down.
And you can see here, if they were successful in putting nuclear weapons in Cuba, they could possibly reach well into the United States. Certainly New York, Washington, D.C., the major centers of the country would be wiped out. In 1963 to 73 was the Vietnam War. The U.S. tried to stop South Vietnam from becoming communist. So just like North Korea, Vietnam was divided. And this is a bad picture of Vietnam, but here you go. It was divided north and south, with the north being communist. Unlike Korea, in this case, the communists won. Eventually, the north win the entire country and unite it under one rule, being communist. In 1989, after a very long time, communism does start to fall apart, and in the fall of the Berlin Wall, it's taken down by the people of Berlin. This is the end of the Cold War.
Here's a picture of the Soviets coming through, breaking down the wall, and East Germany and West Germans embracing as one. This has been a quick look at the Cold War in 15 minutes. Hope you enjoyed it.